A series of mass graves have been discovered in Canada, bearing the remains of over 1,600 Indigenous children. These children were sent to residential schools in Canada as part of a program to cut them off from their native cultures and indoctrinate them with Western colonial upbringing. These mass graves are, however, just one small piece of the overall picture and already show the very vicious and cruel nature of cultural genocide and ethnic cleansing in Canada. It's a reality that few are willing to grapple with and the extent of which we've barely even begun to understand. I'm Richard Medhurst and you're watching the Communiqué. In Canada, several mass graves have been discovered just a few weeks apart, containing the remains of over 1,600 Indigenous children. These mass graves were discovered in or near residential schools, also known as boarding schools. The children of Native Americans were forcibly taken from their parents and tribes and sent to these schools in order to cut them off and isolate them from their communities and indoctrinate them with a settler colonial upbringing. The first of these recent discoveries came about on May 28, 2021, when the remains of 200 children were discovered in British Columbia at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, the youngest victim among them being 3 years old. The remains were first discovered by the Kamloops First Nation using ground-penetrating radar, which helped them to detect the unmarked graves. A week later, on June 5th, a second site of 80 unmarked graves was found in Manitoba, where Brandon Indian Residential School once stood. On June 25th, a third mass grave was found containing the remains of 751 individuals. Once again, the overwhelming majority of these victims are Indigenous children. This mass grave was found in Saskatchewan by the Cowessess First Nation. It was located at the site of a former school known as the Marieville Indian Residential School. And this will be the largest grave site found to date. A fourth mass grave was then uncovered in Cranbrook on June 30th. 182 unmarked graves were discovered there by the St. Mary's First Nation at the site of the former St. Eugene's Mission Residential School. The discovery of a fifth site was then announced on July 15th. 160 unmarked graves were discovered by the Penalacoot First Nation, where the former Cooper Island Indian Industrial School once stood. All in all, in the span of just a few weeks, the remains of over 1,600 Indigenous children were found at just 5 residential schools across Canada. It makes you shudder to think what other atrocities have yet to be discovered at other residential schools. And although these grave sites were found just recently, the story behind them, the story behind these schools and these atrocities is much older. These residential schools, also sometimes called boarding schools, were originally set up in the 19th century. The Canadian government said that these schools were in order to quote-unquote integrate and assimilate Native American children into Canadian society. For these white European colonial settlers, the goal of these schools was supposedly to civilize the natives, which is a clearly vile and racist mindset. And it's important to keep in mind that these schools didn't just exist in modern Canada, but also in what is today called the United States. And the real goal of these schools was the erasure of Indigenous Americans through cultural genocide. By forcibly removing these children from their parents and their communities, the Canadian government made sure that these children were deprived of learning about their own heritage, their own culture, and their own history. Instead, they would be indoctrinated with the colonial mindset and taught the white man's way, an alternative history, a different language. And in these schools, anyone who spoke their native tongue would be punished, as this was strictly forbidden. In addition to the heartbreaking testimonies of people who attended these schools, are also various records revealing how students were mistreated and neglected. They were never taken care of, but in fact abused and tormented by these institutions. There were hundreds of residential schools in Canada in a system that lasted 120 years from the late 19th to the late 20th century. After the last residential school closed in 1996, Over 150,000 indigenous children had been sent to these colonial institutions where they were separated from their families and thrown into a hostile environment which neglected their culture, negated their heritage, language, and sought to indoctrinate them with a European settler colonial upbringing. In Canada, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the IRSSA, officially recognized 139 Indian residential schools. However, there were many more who did not receive federal funding, but were still engaged in the same vicious practices. In the United States, there were over 350 residential schools, largely based off of the exact same premise with the same racist function. In 2008, the Canadian government set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This body was tasked with providing transparency to the issue of residential schools and documenting the experiences of the people who attended them. After several years, in 2015, a report was issued which found that the system of residential schools amounted to what is effectively cultural genocide. And that's putting it mildly. The report also estimates that around 3,200 indigenous children had died. And that's not taking into account the ones that have been discovered now. Former students and pupils who had attended these schools or had family attending these schools had always spoken of people being disappeared or dying, but these claims were never taken seriously. The graves recently found in Canada were not even admitted to or discovered in the Canadian government's commission. Instead, Native First Nation tribes had to go looking for them and found them themselves. There's no government to help them. Reacting to the news, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called it a dark chapter in the nation's history. However, is it just a chapter? Is it just some isolated incident when the entire country is founded on the premise of colonization and settler colonialism? We'll be right back after this short break. I have the honor of being joined by Nick Estes, who is a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. He is a historian, a journalist, and hosts the Red Nation podcast. Thanks for coming on the show, Nick. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Nick, I wanted to start off with the fact that, there's another 160 unmarked graves that were just found in British Columbia. I mean, at this point, are you surprised by this horrific discovery? Do you think it's going to be the last time? What other atrocities do you think that we've yet to uncover in Canada, in the United States?
So what's happening in Canada was expected. Sadly and unfortunately and tragically, it was expected that this was going to happen, that they were going to discover the graves and the burials and the remains of more children at these boarding schools. I believe shortly after the discovery at Kamloops, which is also in British Columbia, of children there, Marie Sinclair, who's an Indigenous parliamentarian, said that they estimate that the numbers, the numbers are going to be, quite phenomenal, and that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was funded by the Canadian government for about 7 to 8 years between 2007 and 2015, didn't do an adequate job in terms of fully, documenting the scope of the residential school system in Canada. So, for example, they had identified, I think, 139 residential schools, whereas independent researchers, or the First Nations themselves, had identified over 4,000 schools. And if we think about that in terms of the amount of children going through those systems, it's quite immense. If we look and compare Canada to the United States, I would say there's, experts, people I've talked to who've studied the situation, have said that the numbers will be far greater. Because during the boarding school system, when it was, at its height, especially for the off-reservation boarding school system, there were twice as many Native people living in the United States than in Canada. And today, I think that number is around 3 times as many. There's several million Native people alive in the United States. And the documented boarding schools that they have that are comparable to Canada's situation are over 360. So the Canadian government had identified 139 independent researchers in the United States, because these research, the boarding school research in the United States doesn't get any federal funding. It's mainly done by tribes, mainly done by independent researchers and nonprofit organizations. So that's more than double what they identified in Canada. The big difference, though, is that there is a political kind of will to, even though Canada's dragging and its feet, kicking and screaming to do this, because they should have done it during the Truth and Reconciliation process about a decade ago, is that the United States simply doesn't care about Indigenous people, doesn't care to have them represented, doesn't care to even consider them in media representations, culturally. And so the immense amount of erasure in Indigenous society is quite phenomenal.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think it is that people think that these crimes, there's something of the past and there are no other forms of violence still being committed? I mean, these unmarked graves that were just found now, these tragic deaths, this is recent. They didn't take place that long ago, did they?
No, it's important to remember, to put it into kind of a historical framework. If it's not just the boarding school system, right? It's Indian child removal. It's the taking of children from their families and placing them into white institutions, whether it's run by the church, whether it's run by the federal government, or whether it's a private home. And if we think about it in terms of child removal, the scope of which is, spans several centuries. For example, in the early 1800s, the United States created a civilization fund to basically pay churches to take children, Native children, from their families and to educate them and to civilize them. It wasn't until the late 1900s, the late 1800s, right after the kind of intense, bloody exterminationist campaigns that the United States waged against tribes in the western part of the United States, that you see the creation of the off-reservation boarding school system, which was intended to not be a school. I mean, school is kind of a misnomer. It's not the correct definition, because these weren't schools. Children didn't go here and get educations where they could apply them to the realities that they faced at home on reservations. The skills they learned were almost useless, right? But they were drilled with military discipline and flag worship, to a point that, around the time the United States had entered World War I, the enlistment rates of Native people was far beyond that of the average kind of US citizen, even though we at the time weren't US citizens, but we had our ancestors had that military training and discipline that they got from boarding schools. And so at that particular moment in time, about 84% of children went through boarding schools, whether they're federally run or church-run boarding schools. But it was also an attempt to take land from us. So a lot of these tribes, like the tribes that I'm from, they were very resistant to selling their land to the United States or selling it to white settlers. And so by taking the children, they forced the parents to essentially concede to the United States. And the United States, the policymakers that backed boarding schools, called the children hostages for, quote, the good behavior of their parents. And if children weren't sent to boarding school, parents were, they withheld rations, they withheld, any kind of support that they would have gotten from the federal government. So fast forward to 1969. The off-reservation boarding school system isn't as prominent in 1969. However, the taking of Native children from Native families and the placement of them into white families is still an ongoing practice. So in 1969, 1 out of every 3 Native children in the United States had been adopted out to white families. This doesn't even include those who were going into the foster care system. And so this system continued on well into the 2010s, into the present moment. Native children are overrepresented in the foster care system because Native families are considered inept at taking care of their own children. They don't, the families don't have access to whether it's adequate employment, homes, or just the basic necessities to have a safe, clean home for children. And it's seen as Native people's fault, right? When they will pay foster care parents, sometimes thousands of dollars a month to take these children from Native families, when they could just be paying the family or the mother for the expenses of a home or for the expenses of food. Like, so it doesn't make sense, but it's important to remember the intent behind native child removal. It's to destroy the family, because if you destroy the family, you destroy the nation, you destroy the tribe. And if the tribe isn't strong, they're not going to resist against any kind of attacks on the land. And that was the clear intent. Now we can say that because of that, or in spite of this history, Indigenous people are resisting and still resisting. Amongst African American and Black people in the United States, Indigenous people have led historic uprisings for the sovereignty of their land, and not just for the benefit of ourselves, but for the benefit of every American to have clean drinking water, clean air, a healthy environment, but also for the rest of the world.
You also talked about how your own relatives were sent to these residential schools, and I was wondering if you could perhaps share some of their experiences with us, so the viewers can maybe understand a bit more of what it was like.
It's quite difficult to talk about, and it's important to point out that you asked a question about how recent the experiences of this are. I have people in my own family and my own circle of friends whose parents were survivors of residential schools. So this isn't something that happened in the past, right? And so the family that I have that went to a place called St. Joseph's Indian School, which is run by the Catholic Church, or a diocese of the Catholic Church, there have been, as I've counted, there have been over 36 documented allegations from former students against this specific school. I've counted 36, and I'm sure there's more documented cases of this, but that's all I could find, because the Catholic Church and this diocese specifically has literally crafted, or through its lawyers has crafted laws to prevent these survivors from coming forward and taking lawsuits against the church or the school. So it's almost as if they're trying to erase history, right? And it's important to remember that the goal of these, there's a reason why I don't speak Lakota. There's a reason why I can't speak my own language. And oftentimes people will ask me that, or other people that, and the reason why the vast majority, or a good portion of us in Indian country, don't speak our own languages is because of boarding schools. They instilled not only the erasure of those languages, but the shame of being an Indigenous person in the United States, right? Because it was tied to shame. It was tied to the erasure, or not just of culture, but the domination of children by these white, patrons, whatever their priests, school administrators. And for a lot of people, it was torture, it was horror. It wasn't a good experience. Not to say that all experiences are the same, but for a good portion of people, that had negatively impacted them. And for those that survived, they live with that to this day, right? The things that they experienced as children that they shouldn't have experienced as children. So I think that's important to remember. And it's, the Catholic Church, there's all this kind of back and forth with the Pope about whether or not he's going to apologize. But the fact of the matter is that the United States has integrated these really archaic, theocratic traditions and laws from the Catholic Church dating back to the 15th century. When it comes to Indian law. So the way that Indigenous people are dealt with the federal government is according to the doctrine of discovery, which essentially grants Christian nations the right of conquest and domination over non-Christian peoples. And you would think that, this country would have moved past it, but it's still integrated in federal Indian law. That's why Eloise Cobell, as I mentioned before, had to sue the government for money that we were owed and resources that we were owed as Indigenous people. That's why we can't own land on our own reservations the way that the full property owners in the United States can enjoy the full benefits of land ownership. That's why our lands are continually pillaged for resources. That's why nobody asks for our consent when they want to build projects on things. So I think it's not just an issue for Indigenous people. I think if everyday, Americans in the United States, people across the world, if they understood these abuses, they would be fundamentally against it. But it gets to the very heart of what the United States is and how it's behaved historically, not just to Indigenous people, but to other people around the world. And that's our question to grapple with, but it has to be done in a truthful and ethical way.
And Nick, just as a last question, because you mentioned people around the world, and you know the Red Nation, where you host your podcast, there's a great quote that says, Palestine is the moral barometer of Indigenous North America. I was hoping, could you maybe tell us how the Palestinian struggle connects or relates to the Native American struggle, and why it's so important for people to support and to understand both of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's direct ties going back to the 70s when the indigenous movement in North America was trying to seek representation at the United Nations. We didn't know how to navigate, the channels at the United Nations, and the Palestinians had mastered it, right? They had successfully, garnered international kind of support and solidarity for their movement. And so they taught us how to navigate those channels, and we owe it to them. We saw the struggles as the same, and this didn't have a lot of currency in the United States, especially with the ruling class, the liberal and conservative elite, because they didn't want us to think beyond the boundaries of the US and to see ourselves as global people. And Palestinians really taught us that, and I would say the situation, is very similar in terms of settler colonialism, the intent to eliminate a native population and to replace it with a foreign invading population. Like, that's the process that's underway in Palestine. It's what we experienced in the 19th century. We're still experiencing it, but not to the same degree as Palestinians are in terms of the intensity of actual, still physical combat and fighting and things of that nature. But it's important to point out that that settler colonial project would not be possible without the settler colonial project here in the United States. And that's something that we understand as Indigenous people here.
It's important to understand that these mass graves are not isolated incidents. This is the very nature of colonialism. To kill the native population, to steal its land, exploit its children, and erase its culture and language. The very reason those native children were sent to these residential schools was not because the European colonizers wanted to supposedly help them out of the kindness of their hearts. The whole point was to make those children forget their ancestry, their communities, parents, families, and leave behind their culture and heritage. It was to destroy any hope of future generations carrying forward the culture and traditions of their forefathers. This is just another way of killing the natives. It is cultural genocide. And in addition to the cultural genocide, we of course have the actual genocide itself, also in the schools. These thousands and thousands of children who were discarded as if they're not even human beings. This is absolutely shameful. The killing, the starvation, the disease brought to the natives by the European colonizers is, again, not an isolated incident or some accident. It is the very nature of colonialism. The native population has to suffer so that the colonizer can profit. This has always been the case, whether in the past or now or in the future. These atrocities at these residential schools were allowed to happen. They were allowed to continue because school administrators, teachers, government officials, the entire chain of command allowed it to happen. They didn't care. And it is said that 60% of these schools were run by the Catholic Church, but there is nothing Christian about any of this. And to say that these schools were meant to civilize the natives, there is nothing civilized about these schools. This is barbaric. This is the real face, the true nature of colonialism. The natives of North America, of South America, Central America have been erased. In Canada and the United States, they have been completely removed from their cultural and political and economic spheres, right on their own land. And while conservatives speak of making America great again and liberals speak of diversity, whose America is this really? And where is the diversity when the very natives of these lands are killed and erased? The theft of land, colonization, war, disease, plundering. This is what the European settlers brought with them. They committed genocide against millions of Native Americans. Natives have absolutely no representation politically, culturally, economically. Their voice is practically unheard. And the residential schools, they are an extension of that. Cultural genocide, making sure that all these children were cut off from their families, their language, their culture, and even then, thousands were left to die and buried secretly in unmarked graves. This speaks to the absolute cruelty and inhumanity of settler colonialism. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.